Hey guys, this is Mr. Miller. I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about history of the railroads in the United States, accompanying what we've been doing in the textbook. I talk a little bit about, the Industrial Revolution and the effects that the railroad has had on not just the expansion of the United States in terms of population, but also its economy. So I just wanted to take a few minutes to talk to you guys a little bit about what were the effects of the railroads on the United States. Um, okay, so the impact of the railroad, so on the geographic, economic, political, futures of the United States was pretty enormous. Not just because of the sheer like physicality of the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, um, which was completed in 1869. We'll get that a little bit later. But it was just the ability for the railroads to connect people and connect the country. So a little bit about the rail history here in the United States. The first railroads in America were actually horse-drawn, and there was actual Ohio lines that had rail cars that were just pulled by horses. Um, but then with the development of the steam engine in England, railroads actually became a pretty legit business opportunity. Um, the era of railroad building began in 1830 when Peter Cooper built a locomotive called Tom Thumb, and it was put into service and traveled 13 miles along what became known as the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad line. You actually see a picture of that railroad here, um, or that the Tom Thumb. Um, the interesting thing about Tom Thumb, it was in 1830 that in order to showcase the future of railroads and what the steam engine could do, they actually had the rail car race a horse in front of a huge audience of people. And in the end, actually, Tom Thumb actually lost to the horse, but it actually showed what it was meant to do. That just using the power of steam was able to carry a large number of people over a long stretch of rail, um, you know pretty quickly. It definitely got some speed under it. So after that, the interest in railroads sort of exploded. uh, about 1,200 miles of railroad track were laid between 1832 and 1837. uh, in the 1860s, which we'll be exploring a little bit later on, the construction of the Transcontinental Railway brought together, two coasts, east and western coasts, um, together for the first time. The impact of the railroad traffic was no less than a revolution of communication for new territories of the rapidly expanding United States, which we're going to see uh, here. So we have more of a interconnected society now, thanks to the railroads. Um, Communities were able to easily work together. Um, with the use of the steam engine, people were able to travel to distant locations much more quickly, obviously, than if they were using only horsepower transportation. Um, so we have here in 1869 the Union and Central Railroad, Pacific Railroads. They finally came together and joined their rails at Promontory Summit, sorry, which was the Utah Territory, and now we have the Transcontinental Railroad. The entire nation was joined with 1,776 miles of track. Um, the Transcontinental Railroad, again connecting the east and the west, meant that the frontier could be extended with a greater movement of population. So we're just going to see a huge population explosion result of this. Um, the railroad is going to allow people to change their place of living with greater ease than ever before. And so what we're going to see now is an effect. What kind of effect did it have on the economy? Um, so obviously, railroad meaning we can now ship things greater distances in less time. So what kind of opportunities is that going to create? So with the dawn of this new rail network, it expands available markets for goods. Now, you know, states and cities that were once too far away for you to go and sell things, now you can ship stuff very easily and a lower cost thanks to the railroad. An item for sale in New York can now make it out west in a much shorter time. The railroads allowed movement of a wider variety of goods to much further distances. So it had a sort of a twofold effect on the economy. Sellers found new markets in which to sell their goods, and individuals who lived on the frontier, we're talking about out west, were able to obtain goods that had previously been unavailable or extremely difficult to get, but now were more widely available. So not only did the railways provide greater opportunity through these, extending markets, but they also sort of jump-started this whole entrepreneurial era that allowed people to, wanting to start new businesses because of the railways and, just the easier time they had to, ship things and not just ship things, but also ship people. Um, so we have, a much uh, uh, an increased demand and the need for factories. Um, so the Industrial Revolution brought upon, you know, the advent of the railroad, but then created this new economy of factories, an industrial economy. People working in, large housings with, giant machines powered by steam, able to build and create things at such a faster pace and at such greater amounts. So it's gonna help expand the market, um, and make demand much larger for products than ever before. And then as the railway extended, obviously further west, okay, and it connected our country together thanks to the Transcontinental Railroad. We saw westward expansion exploded. You know, we see a huge increase in immigrants coming into America because people now have the opportunity to move out west. And before, when they didn't have the ability to pack up their families and go find a new place to live, now it's easier than ever. So new settlements are going to start springing up all throughout America, mostly as close to the new railways and the new rail depots that are going to be built. For instance, through my studies, I learned that, in Davis, California, where there was a rail depot, Southern Pacific Railroad Depot, actually was the site of where University of California, Davis is now. That whole college, that university sprung up out of an old depot because that's where people, got off. So the end destination, would often remain a focal point settlement, but people were able to, as I said before, move their whole families greater distances. Towns along those routes, they also thrived. New towns sprung up at regular intervals of stations where travelers could find layover points, and residents find new markets for goods. Um, Now, some of the, obviously, they're not all positive effects. There are a lot of negative effects too. With this industrial economy sort of taking over the country, and the expansion of the railroads across the plain states and into the western coasts. It's going to facilitate European settlement of the West to a much larger extent, and it's going to increase the disruption of Native American cultures, and start seeing Native American people and tribes being pushed off their lands. Um, as America continues to build more rails and more lines, they're building them through Native American territories, and so it's going to force many Native Americans off their lands. Um, and we'll talk a little bit more about that at a later date. Um, But there's also a huge environmental, impact of the building of this railway. We have, just for instance, there was and I found this in my studies, um, the construction, altered the landscape, of obviously of the environment that they were building through, but it also facilitated the disappearance of a lot of animals who called this environments their home. Um, Before we actually built the railroads, there was an estimated 30 to 60 million buffalo that roamed through the plains here, providing meat and furs and, bone for tools for people to make. But then as more and more trains were being built, massive hunting parties uh, would actually travel by train and kill buffalo for sport, not so much for meat or other means, but for entirely for sport. And by the end of the century, we were gone from 30 to 60 million buffalo down to just 300 that were known to exist. Um, Obviously, those numbers have increased since then, but we wiped out almost an entire species of animal because of this growing expansion. And finally, as we're going to learn later on by the end of the year, railroads are going to play a huge and vital role in the American Civil War. As we're going to see, they're going to allow the North and South to move men and equipment vast distances to further their own war aims. Because of their strategic value to both sides, they also became focal points of each side's war efforts. So they would send out soldiers and men to try and capture rails, try and capture depots because of what an advantage it was. Um, for example, Corinth, Mississippi, they had a very key railroad hub located there, and it was taken first by the Union shortly after the Battle of Shiloh in May 1862, and then later the Confederates are going to recapture it, and it sort of kind of exchanges hands multiple times because both sides really needed to get as much of the railroad under their possession as possible. But as we'll see when we talk about the advantages between North and South during the Civil War, the North, in terms of just railroads and the ability to transport men and supplies, they're going to have the huge advantage because they're going to have somewhere around 85 to 90% of railroads in Northern Territory. So they're definitely going to have the advantage then. Um, all right, so that's really all today that I wanted to talk about. Obviously, this is a small part of the lesson that you guys are reading through and the summary that you're writing for me. But I just wanted to expand a little bit upon what you guys have been reading and um, what we'll be talking about in class. So thank you for listening.